The blood had stopped pooling hours ago. Now it just sat there, dried and dark, caked into the Afghan dirt around her body, like the earth itself had tried to hold her in place. The sun was dropping behind the Hindu Kush, and the shadows it threw were long and cold, and the woman wedged beneath the rock outcrop did not move, except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. 11 wounds. Not one, not three. 11 separate points where metal had torn through cloth and skin and found the muscle underneath. Some were deep, some were jagged. One had passed within 2 centimeters of her carotid artery, close enough that the surgeon in Germany would later go quiet for a moment before writing his notes. Her name was Maya Reeves. She was 26 years old. She weighed 119 pounds. Her left hand was pressed against a wound that was not hers. Her right hand gripped a tourniquet, also on someone else applied hours ago, the rubber still tight and true. Her lips were cracked white. Her radio had been dead since sometime in the night, and yet her mouth was moving. Coordinates. Bearing. Northeast ridge, 300 meters. 2 tangos effective range, 800. Sniper nest elevated position sandbagged. Nobody heard her. But Maya Reeves kept talking because that is what a United States Navy corpsman does. They keep working until someone tells them to stop. Hour 41 and nobody had told her to stop yet. This is not the story of how she survived. This is the story of the 72 hours that brought her there and the promise she had kept for 10 years until keeping it meant watching the men beside her die. You come. The C-130 touched down at Bagram at 0430 hours, and Maya was the last one off the ramp. She had learned that early in field training at Camp Pendleton in the Rocky Hills above Coronado, in the kind of instruction that is not written in any manual, but gets passed down anyway person to person by the people who have already made every mistake worth making. Being first off a bird means being first to wait in the dark while everyone else catches up. Corpsmen don't rush unless someone is bleeding. Nobody was bleeding yet. The air hit her like a door swung open in front of a furnace. Even before dawn, even in March, the Afghan air carried a weight to it, dust and cold, and something else underneath, something older. The smell of a land that had been fought over so many times that violence had become part of its geology. She stood at the bottom of the ramp and breathed it in and let her eyes adjust to the dark. The Hindu Kush rose to the north. Not hills walls, black against the slightly less black of the pre-dawn sky, massive and indifferent and absolute. Somewhere up in those walls was FOB Kestrel. Somewhere up in those walls was SEAL Team 4. Her new team. She had been with Team 3 for 2 years, then 6 months with Team 7, and now she was here because a spot had opened when the previous corpsman, a man named Chief Patterson, had rotated out after 3 consecutive deployments. 3 years of work. 3 years of trust earned incrementally the way all real trust is earned through small actions and demonstrated judgment and the willingness to make hard calls in bad moments. She would start at zero here. She understood that. It did not make it easier. Her pack hit the tarmac with a sound like a body dropping. 65 pounds of medical supplies, personal gear, and the weight of a promise she had made standing beside a flag-draped coffin in a military cemetery outside Portland, Oregon in October of 2007. She had been 16 years old. Her mother had been standing to her left, very still, the way people stand when they are holding themselves together by sheer force of will. The promise was simple. The promise was, I will heal. I will not fight. The pack was regulation issue. The promise was not. A staff sergeant materialized from the darkness near a row of Humvees and pointed northeast. Corpsman Reeves, your ride is waiting. Teams at the FOB 30 clicks north. They're expecting you. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that SEAL teams were never expecting anyone. They tolerated new arrivals. Sometimes. On good days. She shouldered the pack and walked toward the vehicles. The ride north took 90 minutes on roads that barely qualified as suggestions. The Humvee bucked and swayed, and Maya kept her hand on the overhead grip and her eyes on the terrain outside the scratch window, watching the ridgelines the way her father had taught her to watch ridgelines back when watching was a game they played on camping trips in the Cascades, and the stakes were nothing more serious than being first to spot a deer. That was a long time ago. The forward operating base came into view just as the sky began to lighten at its edges. A collection of HESCO barriers, concertina wire plywood structures, and the particular exhausted silence of a place where people have been doing difficult things for too long. The Humvee stopped outside a structure marked medical in faded black paint. The driver pointed east. Briefing tent, can't miss it. She shouldered the pack and walked. Nah. The briefing tent smelled like gun oil, cold coffee, and the specific staleness that accumulates when a group of hard men have been living close together in a confined space for too many weeks. It was a smell Maya had cataloged in her first deployment and learned to read the way a doctor reads a chart. It told you how long they'd been out here, how tired they were, how far past the point of easy conversation. Very far, very tired, very long. 5 men sat around a folding table with a tactical map at its center. They all looked up when she entered. 5 sets of eyes, each carrying a slightly different version of the same fundamental assessment. She had seen this before. She knew what they were measuring. The man at the head of the table stood. Mid-40s, silver threading through dark hair at the temples. The kind of face that has been weathered not by sun alone, but by years of making decisions under circumstances where wrong answers had permanent consequences. Commander Reed Calloway. He said his name the way military men say their names, flat, informational, no performance in it. He gestured around the table. My team, Patterson, ran with us for 3 years. Good corpsman. You'll have work to do earning that spot. She nodded once. Understood, sir. The man directly to Calloway's right leaned back in his chair with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided to form an opinion about her and was in no rush to share it. Petty Officer First Class Garrett Holt. Early 30s, dark hair cut close, a jaw set at an angle that suggested he had been let down by new arrivals before, and was operating on the assumption that this one would follow the pattern. He looked at her for a long moment. You look about 100 pounds soaking wet, Doc. You going to hold up on a ruck march? I manage. Manage doesn't get it done when we're 12 clicks deep and someone needs carrying. Then I'll make sure nobody needs carrying, Petty Officer. His expression didn't change, but something in it recalibrated slightly, not respect, not yet, but the first small movement of a needle that had been pointing in one direction for a long time. The man across from Holt spoke next, Senior Chief Hank Malone, late 30s. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence, it was presence, concentrated, compressed. He had the eyes of someone who spent most of his time watching and very little time needing to speak about what he saw. He nodded at her once. Nothing else. The youngest one was Seaman Declan Marsh, 22 at the most, with the open face of someone who had not yet learned to close it down. This is my first deployment, he said, and then seemed to realize he had volunteered that information without being asked and colored slightly. Maya almost smiled. Almost. Stay close to Senior Chief Malone Marsh. He'll teach you what matters. Calloway cleared his throat. Mission brief at 1400. Medical tent is yours until then. We run light, we run fast, and we do not leave people behind. That includes you, Reeves. You keep up or you don't come out with us. I'll keep up, sir. The last man at the table, P. O. Tanner Briggs hadn't said a word. He was watching her the way a craftsman watches someone else handle a tool, professionally curious, reserving judgment. The M24 sniper rifle lay in pieces on the table in front of him, field stripped for cleaning, and his hands rested near it with the unconscious proximity of someone who spent most of their time within arm's reach of a particular instrument. We'll see, Calloway said, and that was the end of the welcome. The medical tent was organized chaos that had calcified into a kind of rough order, supplies stacked in configurations that made tactical sense to someone. IV, bags, and tourniquets and chest seals arranged in clusters that told Maya the previous corpsman had been good at his job. She began reorganizing anyway. Her hands knew what to do when her mind needed somewhere to go. Combat gauze on the left within immediate reach. Tourniquets stacked beside it, 3 cats, 1 softed. Hemostatic agents in the secondary row. Needle decompression kit, 14 gauge, 2 units. Nasopharyngeal airways in 3 sizes. She moved through the arrangement with the fluency of someone who had done this enough times that the actions lived in her muscles rather than her conscious mind. 73 lives, 8 years of service, 0 casualties under her care. Those numbers were real. They were hers. They were also completely invisible to the 5 men who had just assessed her across a folding table and would remain invisible until she had replaced them with something they could witness firsthand. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. What was not in her personnel file, what she had taken specific steps to ensure, was not there was any mention of the rifle scores, the competition records, the 17 national championships, the 4 international titles, the regional circuit she had run from age 14 to age 18, with her father standing behind her left shoulder, his hand sometimes resting there, light as a question. Her father, Master Sergeant David Reeves, United States Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance. 20 years of service. A man who had taught his daughter to breathe before he taught her to drive, to read when, before she read maps, to understand the geometry of distance and elevation, and the patient stillness required to close that distance with nothing but physics and will. By the time she was 15, Maya Reeves could consistently hit a stationary target at 800 meters. By 16, moving targets. By 17, she was competing against adults and placing in the top 3. Her father had been very proud. Then October 2007 came, and a vehicle in Somalia hit a device buried in a road, and Master Sergeant David Reeves did not come home. She was 16. She stood beside her mother in a military cemetery in the October rain, and she made a promise, and she meant it with every cell in her body. The rifle went into storage. The competitions ended. She finished high school enlisted and chose the rate of hospital corpsman because that was what her promise allowed. She would use what she knew to keep people alive. She would not use what she knew to kill. For 10 years, the promise held. She finished arranging the medical supplies, stepped back, looked at the result, and began reorganizing them a second time. Now, the ruck march began at 0600 the following morning. 12 kilometers full combat load, Afghan heat building from the moment the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline like a statement about intent. Maya's pack weighed 65 pounds. The team's packs ran 70 to 85. She was at a disadvantage, and everyone present understood this. Calloway set the pace. Not brutal but honest, the kind of pace that separates people who are in shape from people who are in the specific kind of shape that field work demands. The first 3 kilometers, Maya held position. Her shoulders absorbed the weight, and her breathing stayed controlled, and her stride remained even on the broken ground. The 4th kilometer, her left boot began rubbing wrong, a blister forming at the heel, the kind of friction that starts as awareness and progresses to distraction and ultimately to the thing you are compensating for without realizing it. She did not adjust her stride. The 5th kilometer, Holt dropped back beside her. "You good, Doc." "Fine. You're favoring your left." "Adapting," he snorted. "There's adapting and there's stubbornness. One keeps you alive." She didn't answer. He moved back to his position. By the 8th kilometer, the pace had slowed marginally. Not enough to be formal. Just enough for her to notice. Just enough to feel like charity extended without acknowledgement, which was somehow worse than being left behind. Senior Chief Malone materialized beside her at kilometer 9 without any announcement of his approach. He said nothing for approximately 40 meters. Then quietly, without looking at her, drink. She drank. Another 40 meters passed. "That blister becomes a problem if you leave it tonight." "I'll handle it." "I know you will." He paused, measuring something. "Patterson taught me something once. Said corpsmen spend every deployment taking care of everyone else. Said it's the job, and he was right. But he also said you can't do the job if you're broken. So you take care of yourself first. That's not selfishness. That's logistics." He walked forward and rejoined the formation without waiting for her response. The last kilometer was the worst. Her vision blurred at the edges from heat and dehydration and the sustained weight of the pack dragging at her spine. But she finished. 12 kilometers full load, broken terrain, Afghan morning. She finished. Calloway was waiting at the rally point. He looked at his watch. 23 minutes off Patterson's best time. "Yes, sir. But you finished." It was not praise, but it was not dismissal either. And in the economy of earned respect, it was a first small deposit into an account that would take weeks to build. She would take it. That evening, while the team ran maintenance on weapons, M4s disassembled on folding tables, cleaning rods and solvent, and the sharp chemical smell of CLP hanging in the air, Maya sat at the edge of the group with her medical kit open, dressing the blister on her heel. Briggs was working on his M24 across the table. The long rifle lay across his knees in pieces, and he was running a bore brush through the barrel with the focused patience of a man performing a ritual he understood completely. He spoke without looking up. 1,400 meters, this gun. Calm air, good position, right ammunition. Further than that, you're asking for miracles. Holt didn't look up from his M4. 1,200 is your practical ceiling. 14's theoretical. Depends on the shooter. Everything depends on the shooter. Maya's hands had stopped moving on the blister dressing. She was looking at the ridgeline to the east, the one that had been catching the last light all evening, in shades of amber and deep red. She was thinking about elevation. The ridge ran at approximately 30 degrees above the valley floor. The wind at that elevation would be running northeast at maybe 4 or 5 miles per hour if the vegetation movement below was any indicator. At 800 meters, that wind would push around approximately. She became aware that her mouth was open. She closed it. She returned her attention to the blister on her heel and finished the dressing with careful precision. Senior Chief Malone, seated 2 tables over with his back to her, had turned his head very slightly in her direction for just a moment before returning to his work. He said nothing. He made no note of what he had noticed. He simply filed it. The test, the real one, came 2 days before the first mission. Declan Marsh appeared in the doorway of the medical tent at 2100 hours, looking the way very young men look when they want to project the impression that they are not concerned about something they are in fact deeply concerned about. "You got a minute, Doc?" "Always. What's wrong?" Nothing's wrong. My leg's been bothering me. Left shin, probably nothing. Sit down. He sat. She examined him with hands that were efficient and certain. Two fingers working from the ankle upward along the anterior tibia until she found the point where his expression shifted from studied neutrality to something he couldn't control. How long has this been hurting? Week, maybe 10 days. It's fine on flat ground. On the ruck march, it got worse. He hesitated. Yeah. She pressed gently 2 points above and below the tender zone, watching his face rather than her hands. The swelling was subtle but present, the kind of finding that most people would attribute to general muscle soreness and ignore, because ignoring it was more convenient than addressing it. Stress reaction, she said. Early stage. If you keep loading that tibia the way you have been, you're looking at a complete fracture. Doc, I can push through it. You can push through it until it snaps. Then you're a casualty, and two men are carrying you instead of covering the team. His face changed. This is my first real operation. I can't get benched. She looked at him for a moment. Not unkindly, but without any softness that would have been dishonest. Marsh, in 8 years, I've saved 73 lives. You know how many I've saved by catching problems before they became catastrophes? I stopped counting somewhere past 200. You think I'm going to let you become number 74 because you wanted to look tough in front of people who already respect you more than you understand? He stared at her. Tell Commander Calloway tonight before the mission brief tomorrow, or I tell him. Silence stretched between them. He went. She watched him cross the open ground between the tents, so a young man carrying the particular weight of having been found out by someone who wasn't fooled, and she thought about the years it had taken her to learn that asking for help was not the same thing as admitting defeat. She was still learning it herself. Marsh told Calloway that night. Calloway benched him. The following morning in the mission brief for the first extraction operation, 2 American aid workers taken 3 weeks ago by a Taliban cell operating in a compound 15 clicks north of the FOB Calloway looked up from the tactical map and found Maya across the table. Good catch, Reeves. I've had operators try to hide worse and compromise the entire team. You assessed a situation and you handled it correctly. Holt spoke without inflection, eyes still on the map. Maybe she's not just 100 pounds of dead weight after all. 119, Maya said. Briggs made a sound that might have been a laugh, small and brief, but present. Small victory. She would take it. Boal. She could not sleep the night before the mission. She lay in her rack staring at the fabric ceiling of the sleeping tent, listening to the generators and the distant pop of gunfire from the ranges and the particular silence that settled over a base in the final hours before an operation, the silence of people who have finished preparing and are now simply waiting, which is the hardest part. Her right hand moved to her shoulder, found the scar there. Old injury, 12 years old now, a ridge of tissue along the posterior deltoid where a simunition round had hit her at close range during force-on-force drills when she was 16. She had not called it, had not stopped. Her father had watched the welt forming through her shirt and pulled her out of rotation. His voice patient and certain you call your hits, Katie. Otherwise, you get sloppy, and sloppy gets people killed. She had been furious with him for 3 days. She had never forgotten the lesson. She rolled onto her side. Tomorrow, she would be stationed at the casualty collection point 2 kilometers from the target. She would set up her aid station and wait, and if the team came back with wounded, she would do what she had spent 8 years learning to do, and she would do it well, and she would not think about the M24 that Briggs would be carrying on his back. She was a corpsman. That was what she had promised. That had to be enough. She pulled her poncho liner up to her chin and closed her eyes and tried not to hear her father's voice in the back of her mind, patient and low, counting her through the breathing cycle he had taught her before she was old enough to understand what it was for. 4 counts in, hold 7, 8 counts out. Your heart will find the space between beats. That's where the shot lives. She breathed and breathed. And eventually the generators and the distant mountains and the weight of everything she carried receded enough for sleep to find her. The Blackhawks were on the pad at 05:30. Maya took the seat nearest the door, her medical ruck between her feet, 60 pounds of supplies arranged in the order she would need them. Tourniquets first, always tourniquets first. The helicopter lifted and FOB Kestrel fell away beneath them, and the mountains came up on all sides, and somewhere below those mountains were 14 million things that could go wrong. She was ready for this. She had been ready for 8 years. What she was not ready for, what she could not have been ready for, was what would happen 6 hours from that morning when a man she had learned to trust would step back from a fallen rifle, and the silence that followed would say everything the situation required without a single word being spoken. But she didn't know that yet. She checked her kit one final time. Everything in its place. The helicopter banked north and the pre-dawn sky was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge, and Maya Reeves closed her eyes and tried not to think about the weight of the M24 against Briggs's back. Part 2, the promised break. The casualty collection point was a depression in the landscape 2 kilometers south of the target compound, low enough that 3 sides offered natural cover, and long enough sight lines in the 4th direction to give adequate warning of anything approaching from the valley floor. Tactically sound, professionally defensible, safe by the standards of a place where safe was always a relative term. Maya had the aid station set up in 11 minutes. IV stands assembled from tent poles and field-expedient hardware. Trauma kit laid out in the sequence she had determined through 8 years of refining, not the sequence she had been taught in training, but the sequence that had emerged from actual use from the moments when seconds were the unit of measure that mattered. Tourniquets within immediate reach, 3 CAT, tourniquets and 1 SOFTT, dashed wadu, arranged in a line she could find without looking. Combat gauze, hemostatic agents, chest seals both vented and non-vented. Needle decompression kit, everything calibrated to the geometry of the worst things that could happen in the next several hours. Everything in its place. Then she sat down in the dirt and waited. Radio check at 30 minutes. Calloway's voice clipped and calm. Alpha 1 status green. Approaching target from the south. No contact. Copy Alpha 1. Standing by. Radio check at 60 minutes. Malone, Alpha 2 target structure in sight. No contact. Beginning final approach. Copy Alpha 2. At 90 minutes, the radio was quiet. She counted the silence in her head the way she counted breathing, measured, deliberate, held at the edges. At 94 minutes, the ground moved. Not figuratively. The concussive force of the explosion reached her physical position before the sound did a deep pressure wave that she felt in her chest cavity, and behind her eyes the particular physics of a large detonation at close range translated through earth and air. The sound followed immediately a deep, heavy crump that rolled across the valley and kept rolling, bouncing off the ridgelines until it became a continuous rumble. Then the smoke column, black and immediate, rising from the northeast. Maya's hands were already moving before she was consciously aware of having decided to move them. Alpha 1, this is Lima 6. Confirm status. Static. Alpha 1, confirm. Then Calloway's voice, and it was the first time she had heard anything in it other than flat professional control. IED, we have wounded. Holt has hit significant trauma left leg. We are coming to you. Hold position. Understood, I'm ready. The gunfire started 40 seconds later. Distant at first, the flat crack of M4 fire interspersed with the heavier, less disciplined bark of AK-47s. Then closer. Then the sound of men moving fast across broken ground, the metallic percussion of gear, and the hard breathing of people carrying more than their equipment, and then they came over the low rise to her south, and she saw them. Malone and Briggs carrying Holt between them. Calloway moving rearward, laying down suppressing fire in controlled 3-round bursts. The 2 recovered aid workers stumbling forward under their own power, their faces carrying the particular blankness of people who have survived something they are not yet able to fully process. They lowered Holt at her feet. His left thigh was wrong in the way that a compromised structural member is wrong, the angle slightly off the fabric of his uniform, dark and wet from the knee upward, the blood still coming in pulses that told her everything she needed to know before she touched him. Femoral artery. She had 90 seconds. Not 90 seconds before things got serious. 90 seconds before unconsciousness, and after that, 3 minutes before the math stopped working in his favor entirely. The tourniquet was in her hand before she knelt. High and tight above the wound, applied with the force and precision that the situation required regardless of what the patient says or does. Because the tourniquet placed correctly is the only intervention that matters in the next 90 seconds, and everything else is detail. Holt screamed. She tightened it 1 additional full rotation. Dr. Malone behind her. Get back to your positions. I have him. They hesitated for exactly 1 second, then they moved. She packed the wound with combat gauze and applied pressure with both hands and leaned her weight into it, and she talked to Holt in the flat, even tone she had developed over years precisely because it was the opposite of alarming, not cheerful, not false, just present. IV started in his right arm, fluids running. His breathing was rapid and shallow, the body redirecting resources to its core priorities. Stay with me, Holt. You're not going anywhere today. He said something through his teeth that was not entirely coherent. She took it as a positive sign. The gunfire intensified. She could hear Calloway directing fire onto the elevated position, the controlled communication of a commander managing a fluid situation with fewer assets than the situation called for. Then Briggs's voice on the radio, and it had something in it she had not heard from him before. I'm hit. Shoulder. I can't hold the M24. Calloway, who has a shot on that ridge? Silence. The kind of silence that fills a space when the answer is nobody. Maya's hands went still on Holt's wound for exactly 1 second. 800 meters. Northeast ridge. She had clocked that ridge line the moment she set up the aid station, the way she clocked every ridge line, the way she had been doing since she was 12 years old. And her father had told her that understanding terrain was the first and most important skill, because terrain is the context inside which everything else happens. The M24 was on the ground where Briggs had gone down 3 meters to her left. She had not fired a rifle in 10 years. She had made a promise. Holt's eyes found hers. Whatever calculation was happening behind them was the calculation of a man who understood exactly what was at stake and what was being considered and who was choosing not to say the words that might make the decision for her. He understood that the decision had to be hers alone. Nobody asked her. Nobody told her. She assessed Holt's status one final time stable for the next several minutes. Not indefinitely, but enough. She picked up the M24. 28 pounds of precision engineering stock and barrel, and optic, the architecture of a tool designed to close distance with absolute efficiency. The weight of it in her hands was not unfamiliar. That was the thing she had not anticipated. The 10 years fell away the moment she felt the balance of it. The stock finding her shoulder the way a key finds a lock. The optic coming to her eye with the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions that did not care how long they had been waiting. She dropped prone at the edge of the depression. Her elbows found the ground. Rocky, hard, indifferent. She registered the pain and set it aside. Through the scope, the ridge resolved into detail. Sandbags, a rifle barrel, movement in the shadow behind the position. She ranged at 847 meters. Wind from the east 3 to 4 miles per hour, judged by the vegetation on the ridge and the dust movement on the valley floor. Elevation, the target was above her by approximately 12 degrees. Her father's voice. Breathe, Katie. 4 counts in. Hold 7. 8 counts out. Let your heart find the space between beats. Inhale. 4 counts. Hold. 7. Exhale. 8. Her heart rate dropped. She felt it drop the way she had always felt it, a physical settling, the body coming into alignment with the task. She found the space between beats. She squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the shot broke across the valley, and she tracked through the scope and watched the round impact 2 feet left of the target, kicking rock and dust in a small, violent cloud, and the shooter behind the sandbags did not go down. She had missed. 10 years of rust. 10 years of keeping a promise. 2 feet left on an 800-meter shot. Calloway's voice on the radio, controlled in flat negative impact. Sniper still effective. Her hands were not shaking. She had expected them to. Instead, there was something very still in her, something that had been held in the back of her chest for a long time and had now apparently decided this was the moment it had been waiting for. She cycled the bolt, chambered the next round, adjusted for the wind, a half-minute of angle left, elevation confirmed. Her father's voice again, but different this time, quieter. The voice he used when he was not instructing, but simply present beside her. You're not choosing who to be. You're choosing who to save. 4 counts in, hold, 8 counts out. The space between beats, she squeezed. 847 meters. The round traveled the distance in just over a second. Through the scope, she watched the shooter jerk backward, saw him fall behind the sandbags. The rifle barrel tilted skyward and went still. 4 seconds of silence on the radio. Then Calloway confirmed kill. Sniper down. He stopped. What the hell, Doc? She was already moving back to hold. She set the M24 down with the deliberate care of someone handling something they are not certain they will allow themselves to pick up again, and she knelt beside her patient and checked the tourniquet and assessed his color and breathing and mental status. Holt was looking at her with the expression of a man revising a calculation he had been running for a week and finding that every variable he had assigned was wrong. You're going to be fine, she told him. He said nothing, but he didn't look away. The team consolidated at the casualty collection point 17 minutes later. The 2 aid workers, both alive, were stabilized and prepared for movement. Calloway called for immediate extraction. The Black Hawk came in 12 minutes later, and Holt was loaded aboard with Briggs, whose shoulder wound was significant but not critical. The bird lifted. The sound diminished. And then it was gone, and the valley was quiet, and the 5 remaining people stood in the rotor wash and watched the empty sky. Calloway looked at her. My tent. Now. He waited until they were inside and the flap was closed, and then he stood across the folding table from her with his arms crossed and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was processing something that didn't fit the existing framework. That shot, he said. 847 meters. You missed once and corrected. Yes, sir. You're a corpsman. Yes, sir. Corpsmen don't shoot like that, he uncrossed his arms. I'll ask one time and I want a straight answer. Who taught you to shoot? She looked at the map on the table. The terrain contours of Kunar province, the ridgelines and valleys, the compound 15 clicks north that was now secured and quiet. My father, she said, Master Sergeant David Reeves, USMC, Force Reconnaissance. He taught me to shoot when I was 12 years old. By 15, I was winning National Youth Precision Rifle Championships. By 16, I was competing against adults. I stopped competing when he was killed in Somalia in October 2007. Calloway's expression shifted. Something moved through it that was not entirely professional. I know that name. Yes, sir. Most people in this community do. He was quiet for a moment. That still doesn't explain an 800-meter shot under fire from a cold start after 10 years away from a rifle. Muscle memory doesn't forget, sir, even when you want it to. Why would you want it to? She looked at him directly now. Because I promised my mother I would never use those skills in combat. That I would heal. That I would not fight. She made me promise it standing beside his casket. She had just lost her husband. I was 16 years old. I meant every word of it. Calloway said nothing. You just broke that promise. I know. I can't get it back. The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. No qualification. No explanation that would have softened them. Just the plain fact of it stated without performance. No, Calloway said quietly. You can't. He looked at the map, looked back at her. We still have follow-on intelligence to process, and in 72 hours we are going to need to address the commander who runs the cell responsible for that IED. You held up in the field today. That matters to me regardless of everything else. He paused. Can you shoot again if we need you to? She thought about the promise, about her mother's face, about the weight of the rifle in her hands and the terrible familiarity of it. If it's necessary to save lives, she said. Yes, sir. Good, because it might be necessary. She walked back to the medical tent. She sat down beside her supply kit and did not reorganize it. She just sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the tourniquet stack and thought about the 847 meters and the way the rifle stock had found her shoulder and the way it had felt right and the way that rightness was the most frightening thing that had happened to her all day. The second mission came 48 hours later. Intelligence had confirmed the Taliban commander responsible for the IED cell was moving between compounds in the northern valley. The window was 24 hours. Calloway briefed the team at 1400 with the efficiency of a man who understood that in operational planning, concision was respect for the time available. 15 to 20 hostiles estimated. The commander alive if circumstances allowed, dead if they didn't. 3 buildings within a walled compound. Guard positions at the northeast and southwest corners. Dusk infiltration timed to evening prayers. Holt was back from the forward surgical team at Bagram. His leg had been sutured and compressed and was functional within the tolerances that a man like Garrett Holt defined as acceptable. He moved slightly differently than he had a week ago, but he moved. He took his position at the briefing table without comment. Briggs's shoulder was wrapped and his arm was in a partial sling. He could not carry the M24 on the primary assault, but could provide limited support from a fixed position. At the end of the brief, Calloway looked at Marsh. The team surgeon at Bagram had cleared Marsh for limited operational duty 4 days after the initial diagnosis. The fracture had not worsened. The strapping was solid. Calloway had studied the surgical clearance for a long moment before folding it and putting it in his pocket without expression. Light duty only, he had told Marsh. Rear security, nothing more. Marsh had nodded with the controlled relief of someone who understood they were being given exactly what the situation warranted, and not a fraction more. Then Calloway looked at Maya. You're with the assault element on this one. Forward with the team. The tent was quiet. She understood what he was saying. She understood what it cost him professionally. She also understood that the team was undermanned and that the mathematics of the situation had arrived at a conclusion before either of them had fully reasoned through it. Yes, sir. Malone was looking at the map. He said nothing. But he had taken the M24 from its case before the brief began and laid it on the table in front of him, and he did not explain why. They moved out at 1800 hours. Full combat load. Maya carried her medical ruck, her M4, and the weight of having crossed a threshold 2 days ago that she was still fully understanding the dimensions of. The approach took 90 minutes through terrain that punished carelessness, ravines deep enough to hide, a squad ridgeline approaches that offered perfect fields of fire to anyone watching from high ground, the kind of landscape that had been used for exactly this purpose for centuries before any of the people moving through it had been born. They reached the final assault position at 1930. The compound sat in a shallow depression below them. Mud brick walls the color of dried earth. 3 buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Lights in the two main structures. Movement on the guard towers. Calloway positioned the team with the precision of long practice. Malone and Holt to the north wall for the breach. Briggs covering the east approach from an elevated fixed position. Calloway taking point through the breach. Marsh on rear security, 50 meters back, covering the southern approach. Maya assigned alongside Marsh, not front line, but not removed from the action either. The breach went at 19:30 precisely. The demolition charge was controlled violence, exactly enough to open the north wall without bringing the structure down, and the team moved through the gap with the trained fluency of people for whom this choreography had become reflex. Maya held her position, M4 up, sector assigned, eyes moving systematically across the approaches. The firefight inside the compound was the sound of disciplined fire answering undisciplined fire. The controlled 3-round bursts of M4s against the longer, louder rattling of automatic panic. Shouted commands in English. Screams in Pashto. The universal language of violence translating across cultures without difficulty. Building 1 secured at 90 seconds. Calloway's voice on the radio even and methodical. 3 enemy KIA, moving to building 2. Maya's sector was quiet. She allowed herself to think it might stay that way. She was wrong. The RPG team materialized from the depression to her southwest. 3 men. They had been in a fold of ground she had not been able to clear from her assigned position in the gap between what the intelligence had predicted and what the intelligence had missed. One carried the launcher already shouldered, already tracking aim point, not at her position, but at the breach in the north wall where her team was moving. 70 meters. Maya's training did not deliberate. 3-round burst center mass, the RPG gunner. The rounds found him. He went down folding at the knees, but his finger had already found the trigger in the final involuntary spasm of a nervous system shutting down. The rocket launched. The dying man's aim had shifted as he fell, not toward the compound, toward her. 70 meters gives you approximately 2 seconds when high explosives are involved. She moved left toward the rock outcrop, and she almost made it. The RPG hit the wall 6 feet to her left. The concussive wave picked her up and threw her with the absolute indifference of physics applied to a human body, and she hit the ground and the rocky earth rose to meet her with no interest in her continued function. The world became a single sustained tone, high and clean and disconnected from everything outside it. She was on her back. Stars overhead, she could see them through the smoke. She ran the assessment automatically the way she ran every assessment, beginning with the question that determined everything else. Was she functional? She moved her right hand, it responded. She moved her left hand, it responded. She tried to sit up and the world tilted sideways, but corrected after a moment, the vestibular system renegotiating with the environment. Someone was screaming. The second Taliban fighter, the one she had not yet engaged, standing 20 meters to her left. The scream was the sound of a man in pain who was also very frightened, a specific sound she had learned to distinguish from the sound of a man in pain who is a threat. This one was both. Her sidearm cleared the holster. 2 rounds, the screaming stopped. She conducted the full assessment then, because she was a corpsman and assessment was not optional under any circumstances. Left thigh 2 fragments deep, penetration bleeding significant. Right thigh 1 fragment, smaller but ragged, bleeding moderate. Left shoulder 1 fragment through the deltoid, functional but compromised. Right side below the ribs 1 fragment, breathing painful, possible intercostal involvement. Lower abdomen superficial laceration, bleeding slow. Left forearm long gash from a fragment that had tumbled rather than penetrating cleanly. Right bicep deep penetration, grip strength reduced but present. She reached back carefully and found 2 more distinct points of sharp specific pain in her upper back. Her neck. She touched it gently with 2 fingers working along the right side of the carotid triangle and found the graze approximately 2 centimeters from the vessel. 2 centimeters. She filed that number and then moved forward. 11 wounds total. Blood loss significant but not yet in the range that made consciousness impossible, which meant she was functional, which meant she had work to do. She pulled a cat tourniquet from her medical kit, applied it high on the left thigh above the worst of the bleeding. The pain was extraordinary, the kind the body generates specifically to communicate that this situation requires immediate attention and cessation of activity. She tightened the tourniquet 1 additional rotation. Made no sound. Then she got up. The radio crackled. Calloway rear security confirmed status. Rear secure. 3 hostiles engaged. Threats neutralized. Copy. Target acquired. We have the commander. Beginning extraction in 2 minutes. Understood. She did not mention the wounds. She did not mention the blood soaking through her uniform. She did not mention that standing upright required the specific concentration she normally reserved for the most complex interventions. Calloway had 2 minutes on his extraction timeline. If she came on the radio with her status, He would divert attention and potentially compromise the extraction of the objective they had spent 48 hours planning. She was stable enough to function. The team needed a corpsman more than they needed to know she was hurt. The calculation was not complicated. She walked forward to meet them. The team came through the breach 4 minutes later. Calloway had the Taliban commander in flex cuffs. Malone and Holt provided cover. Marsh brought up the rear, one hand pressed against his right side where shrapnel had caught him during the firefight, his face pale but his eyes still doing the job they were supposed to do. Maya was already moving toward him when they came over the rise. "Let me see," she said. He took his hand away. The wound was deep but clean there. The fragment had entered the oblique muscle and stopped before finding anything vital. Serious, not immediately life-threatening. She packed it with combat gauze, started the IV, administered morphine at the dosage that would manage the pain without compromising his awareness, and told him to keep pressure. Dr. Calloway, 2 meters away, looking at her directly. "You're bleeding." Marsh's wound takes priority. He opened his mouth, closed it. He had learned by now that arguing with Maya Reeves about medical priorities during active treatment was a conversation that ended the same way every time. "Handle it," he said. "We exfil in 3 minutes." She moved to Calloway's shoulder next to fragment taken during the extraction minor, but requiring intervention, and removed it with forceps in the manner of someone performing a familiar task methodically and without ceremony. Dressed it, told him to change the dressing in 12 hours. Then she stood up. The world tilted. She had been running on the narrow margin that training and will can provide, and the margin had reached its outer limit. The blood loss had been accumulating with every minute she had spent on her feet, and the body had been compensating quietly and thoroughly, and now it was done compensating. Holt was there before she reached the ground. His hands caught her not gently the way you catch something fragile, but firmly the way you catch something valuable. He lowered her to the ground and began cutting her uniform immediately because that was what you did, and Maya watched his face as he found what was underneath. He cut away the left side of her shirt, stopped, cut away the right side, stopped again. His lips were moving. She realized after a moment that he was counting. 1, 2. He worked methodically down her left side, then her right, then her arms. 8, 9. He found the graze on her neck, and his hands went very still for exactly 3 seconds. 10, 11. He looked up at Calloway, did not speak, simply looked at him with 11 in his eyes and waited while Calloway's face went the color of the mud brick wall surrounding them. Then Holt reached into Maya's own medical kit, the kit whose layout he had watched her establish on the first morning at the FOB, the kit she had organized and reorganized until the sequence was as natural as breathing, and he took out a second cat tourniquet and applied it to her right thigh with the correct tension and the correct placement, efficiently and without hesitation. Exactly as she had taught him. She looked at his hands, steady, certain. She looked at his face. He was not looking at her. He was doing the work. Something eased in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. The radio crackled. Weather report from base. Sandstorm inbound from the west, estimated arrival 20 minutes. All aircraft grounded. Duration unknown, preliminary estimate 18 to 48 hours. The number settled over the group with the weight of the storm that was about to arrive. Calloway looked at his team, the commander in flex cuffs, Marsh with his IV and his pale, steady face, Malone watching the perimeter, Holt kneeling over Maya with blood on his hands and his jaw set at the angle of a man who has decided something and will not be moved from it. "Find us a defensible position," Calloway said. "We go to ground until the storm clears." He looked at each of them in turn. "We keep her alive. That is the mission now. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." The storm came in 40 minutes later, ahead of the estimate, the way storms always arrive ahead of estimates in places like this. It hit the valley like a door closing, and the world contracted to a radius of 10 meters, and within that radius, a team of men built an aid station out of field equipment and what they had learned by watching a corpsman work. Marsh, between checks on his own wound, told stories about his family in Ohio, his mother's care packages, his younger sister who wanted to join the Navy, and who he had been advising against it on the grounds that she was too smart for the hardship and too stubborn for the discipline, and who was going to do it anyway. Malone checked the tourniquets every 15 minutes. Not 14, not 16, 15, with the same precision and quiet he brought to everything, adjusting tension where required, monitoring color and temperature in the extremities, keeping notes on a small pad that he did not show anyone. Calloway was on the radio every 30 minutes without exception, working through the chain of aviation assets and weather forecasts and medevac priorities, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a man who has identified the one thing he will not allow to fail. Holt rationed their water. When he distributed it, he gave Maya her portion first and took his last. He did this without comment and without looking at anyone to see if they had noticed. At hour 42, Maya Reeves stopped talking in the middle of a sentence about arterial pressure and tourniquet positioning and closed her eyes and did not open them. Malone checked her pulse. Present, shallow. He looked at Calloway. She's been running on will, he said. The body's out of credit. Calloway picked up the radio. The storm answered with static. He tried again and again, because she had given 11 wounds worth of herself to keep this team alive, and he was not going to let a weather system be the last word on the subject. Outside, the Hindu Kush was invisible in the blowing sand, patient, ancient, waiting as it always waited for whatever came next. Part 3. Both hands. The storm broke at hour 46. Not gradually the way storms break in places where weather is a negotiation. It stopped the way a hell breath is released all at once, the pressure lifting the air, going from dense and abrasive to merely cold, and the stars appearing over the eastern ridgeline as if they had been there the entire time and had simply been waiting for permission to be seen. Calloway was on the radio before the last of the sand had settled. He had been on the radio every 30 minutes for 46 hours. His voice had not changed in any way that most people would have noticed. But Malone, who had been listening to that voice for 3 years, heard the thing underneath it that the voice was working very hard to contain. Alpha 1 to any aviation asset, we have a critical casualty, multiple penetrating trauma, significant blood loss, currently unconscious. 46 hours post-injury. We need immediate medevac at grid. He gave the coordinates precisely and waited. The response came from a different voice than the weather controllers he had been arguing with for 2 days. Older. The kind of authority that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Alpha 1, this is Medevac 7. We have a bird in the air. Your position in 12 minutes. What is the nature of the casualty? Calloway paused for exactly 1 second. Our corpsman, he said. A pause on the other end, brief but present. Copy Alpha 1, 12 minutes, keep her warm. Calloway set down the radio and looked at his team. Malone kneeling beside Maya, 2 fingers on her wrist counting. Holt at the perimeter watching the approaches because someone had to watch the approaches even now, and Holt had made himself that person without being asked. Marsh sitting against the rock wall, Force still running, his face pale but present. Briggs at his elevated position, injured shoulder, wrapped his eyes still working. The Taliban commander in flex cuffs watching all of it, with the expression of a man trying to understand what he was witnessing. 12 minutes, Calloway said. Let's get her ready to move. Malone worked through the preparation systematically, checking each line, confirming the tourniquets, assessing the field dressings, making the small adjustments that kept the margins where they needed to be. He worked with the careful efficiency of a man who had been watching a corpsman for 3 years and had absorbed more of it than he had realized until this moment, when the absorption became application. Holt came down from the perimeter when the rotors became audible from the south. He stood beside Malone and looked at Maya's face, still and colorless in the early morning light. And he said nothing because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more clearly than words could manage. The helicopter came in low and fast, rotors hammering the pre-dawn air, and it settled with the controlled urgency of a crew that understood exactly what they were here for. The skids had not fully touched the ground before a man was out and moving. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Steele was 57 years old, and he moved across the broken ground with the particular economy of someone who has spent 3 decades making fast assessments in bad conditions and has eliminated every unnecessary motion from his process. Silver hair cut short, the face of a man whose authority came not from rank, but from the accumulated weight of what he had seen and kept people alive through. He knelt beside Maya without breaking stride, his hands going immediately through the assessment with the speed of vast experience. 11 penetrating wounds, Malone said. 46 hours since initial trauma. Conscious and working until approximately hour 42. Steele's hands didn't stop. Working, he said, clarify. Calloway from behind him. She treated 3 casualties after sustaining these injuries. Applied tourniquets, started IVs, extracted shrapnel. Under fire conditions, without telling anyone she was hit. Steele's hands went still for just a moment, a pause so brief that someone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. Then they continued their work, moving with perhaps a fraction more deliberateness than before, the way a craftsman's hands move when they understand that what they are working on matters beyond the immediate task. He examined the tourniquets, both of them. Textbook, he said. Both placements. She taught us, Malone said. Steele looked at him, then back at Maya. He checked each IV line, adjusted the flow rate, assessed the field dressings in sequence, with the thoroughness of someone conducting an examination that would determine the next several hours of surgical intervention. He worked in silence for 90 seconds. Then he looked at Calloway. 42 hours, he said, with 11 wounds. Affirmative. He returned his attention to his patient and was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man saying something he meant in the specific and unqualified way that professional people mean things when they dispense with qualification entirely. I've been doing this for 31 years, he said. I've seen things that don't belong in any training manual. He looked at Maya. This doesn't belong in any training manual either. He began preparing her for transport, stabilizing the lines, securing the dressings, making the assessments that would guide the first hour of surgical intervention at Landstuhl. Calloway put his hand on Steele's arm before the stretcher moved. She's one of ours, he said. Bring her back. Steele met his eyes. What she did working 42 hours with these injuries, that's not performance. That's not adrenaline and reflex. He paused. That's character. I'll do everything I can. They loaded the stretcher with the care reserved for something irreplaceable. Every movement deliberate, every shift in position, monitored the men who carried her, moving in the unspoken coordination of people who have operated together long enough that communication happens below the level of speech. Steele climbed in beside her. The helicopter took her weight. The skids lifted. The Black Hawk climbed into the Afghan sky, turned south, and diminished. The team stood in the rotor wash and watched until it was a sound, then an absence of sound, then the pre-dawn silence of the Kunar Valley closing back over the space where it had been. Holt broke the silence first. I told her she was too small for this job, he said. Nobody answered. He looked at the pressed earth where the stretcher had been. The dark stain of it. I was wrong about everything. Malone nodded once slowly, the way he acknowledged things that had been settled beyond any further discussion. Calloway looked at what was left of his team. He said nothing for a long time. Then when we get home, we make sure everyone knows what happened here. What she did, what she is. Yes, the mission was over. The deployment had 3 months left. But something had shifted in that team, some fundamental renegotiation of what they understood excellence to look like and what it cost and what it asked of the people who carried it. They had learned it from a woman who weighed 119 pounds and had kept 11 wounds secret for 42 hours because her team needed a corpsman more than they needed to know she was hurt. They did not forget. Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany sits on a hill above the Palatinate Forest, and its corridors have the particular quality of light that hospitals develop when they have been receiving the consequences of wars for many years. Something in the fluorescence that is both clinical and underneath the clinical, quietly sorrowful, in a way that the staff have learned to set aside in order to function. Maya woke on the 4th day, not gradually. She woke the way soldiers often wake in hospitals, far from where they were hurt completely, and immediately the body snapping to attention before the mind has finished orienting the first instinct, still tactical. She registered the ceiling. White, not canvas, not Afghan sky. She registered the smell, antiseptic and warm air and the particular absence of dust. She registered her left arm in a sling, both legs elevated. The low-grade presence of pain from 11 separate locations that announced themselves in sequence as consciousness confirmed their existence. She was alive. A nurse ran through the standard assessments. Maya answered the questions correctly and without hesitation. An hour later, Calloway walked in. He looked older than she remembered. The lines around his eyes had deepened in the way that specific events deepen lines, as opposed to the gradual work of time. He was in uniform. He carried a small wooden box. He sat down in the chair beside her bed and looked at her for a moment without speaking. You gave us a significant problem, he said finally. Sir, 42 hours, Reeves. I was functional. He looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at her. Doc Steele said the surgical team here went quiet when they reviewed the fieldwork. He said in 31 years he had seen 2 comparable cases, and in both of those cases the individuals were larger. The wounds were fewer, and neither of them reached hour 20. He shook his head slightly. I don't know whether to write you up or recommend you for every commendation the Navy has on the books. You were already doing both while I was unconscious, she said. He almost smiled. The recommendation went up 6 days ago. She looked at the ceiling. Sir, I was doing my job. Your job was medical support. What you did for 42 hours after taking those injuries was something else. He leaned forward slightly. Something that doesn't have a category yet. He set the wooden box on the bed beside her right hand. She opened it. The patch inside was not regulation issue. It was the kind of thing teams make for people who have become something to them that the official insignia doesn't quite cover. The eagle, anchor, trident, and pistol of naval special warfare stitched carefully and personally onto fabric that had clearly been worked on by more than one set of hands. Different thread tensions in different sections. The collective work of people who rarely expressed themselves this way and had chosen to. She turned it over. On the back in black permanent marker, both hands. Always the team. Her throat tightened in the way it does when something reaches a place that has been closed for a long time. Malone's idea, Calloway said. But every one of them agreed. You earned it not for the shooting and not for the wounds. You earned it for what you are. She held the patch carefully, feeling the stitching with her fingertips. I'm a corpsman, sir. You are. And you prove that everything we've been keeping in separate categories, the healing and the fighting, was never actually separate to begin with. You showed us what it looks like when someone is both completely without compromise. She looked at him, then back at the patch. Your mother called 3 days ago, Calloway said. I called her back. She looked at him sharply. She needed to hear what happened from someone who was there. I told her. He paused. She was frightened. She was also proud. In that order, and both of them completely genuine. A silence. She has something for you, he said. She wanted to tell you herself. She asked me to let you know it was coming. He paused. She's been holding it for 17 years. She said she would know when the time was right. He stood to leave. Rest. Heal. We'll talk more when you're stronger. He looked at her one final time with an expression that had moved well past professional assessment into something older and harder to name. Then he walked out, and she was alone with the patch and the white ceiling and the 11 separate points of healing distributed across her body. The phone call came 2 days later in the early evening, when the corridor outside had gone quiet. Her mother's voice was the voice it had always been, steady. Careful, the voice of a woman who had spent decades being the stable thing in a family built partly around instability, around deployments and silences, and the specific discipline of not letting fear become the loudest presence in the room. Tessa, how are you healing? Good. The scars don't hurt anymore. All 11 of them. All 11. A pause that was not empty, full of something being decided. Your father wrote you a letter before his last deployment, her mother said. He did that every time, wrote letters for both of us in case. After he was killed, I read mine immediately. It was everything you'd expect. Everything he would have said if he'd had the time. She paused. Yours was different. I read it once and I understood that it wasn't for the version of you that existed in 2007. It was for a version of you that didn't exist yet. So I kept it. I waited. I thought I would know when the time was right. Mom, I know when the time is right. The silence between them was the most attentive silence Maya had sat inside in years. She was aware of the patch on the bedside table, the 11 separate points of healing along her body, the way the rifle stock had found her shoulder on that ridgeline, as if the 10 years between them had never happened. He wrote, I know you're going to make me a promise, and I know you're going to keep it as long as you can. Her mother's voice was even deliberate, reading with care. That's who you are. You got that from me. But you also got something else, the part that understands that promises made to protect the people you love sometimes have to grow bigger than the words you used when you made them. Maya's hand had found the patch without her instructing it to. You're going to face a moment when keeping the promise means someone else pays the price. When that happens, I don't want you to choose the promise. I want you to choose the people. The promise was always about the people. Don't ever forget that. Her mother paused, then in a voice that was quieter than the rest. Both hands, Katie. That's the only way to hold the world together. You can't do it with one. Maya sat with those words for a long time. The first tears came without announcement and without drama. Not the tears of pain or grief, but of something being released that had been under compression for so long she had stopped feeling the weight of it, the way you stop hearing a sound that has been continuous long enough to become part of the background of everything. Her father had written those words before she made the promise. Before Somalia. Before the cemetery in the October rain. Before 10 years of careful, deliberate, costly restraint. He had known. He had written her the answer to a question she hadn't asked yet, and her mother had held it for 17 years, waiting for the version of her daughter who was ready to receive it. She did not try to stop crying because there was no point in trying to stop the thing that was happening. When it finished, she was very still. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. Small, tentative flakes catching the light of the corridor window and disappearing before they reached the glass. She picked up the patch. She held it between her palms, the hand that had held the rifle and the hand that had held the tourniquet, and pressed them together gently and closed her eyes. 3 months later, she re-enlisted. The designation was New Integrated Combat Medicine Specialist, a rating that had not existed before because the need for it had not been formally acknowledged before. She understood that the rating was in part a bureaucratic admission that the boundaries between healing and fighting had always been more porous than the institution wanted to accept. Holt was her first call. He picked up on the second ring. I'm building something, she said. I need someone who knows what it costs when the training isn't there. He was quiet for a moment. Then when do I report? The first class at Coronado ran 24 students. Navy corpsmen, Army medics, Air Force pararescue jumpers. By the end of 6 weeks, every one of them could transition from tourniquet to rifle and back again without the hesitation that got people killed. Not as well as she could, but well enough, and well enough compounded over enough teams and enough deployments and enough bad nights in bad places was how things changed. Malone visited in the 4th week. He sat in on 2 sessions without comment, watching the students run the drills, and afterward he found her alone in the equipment bay. He said that's the program, not the shooting, the transfer. The idea that what you know becomes what someone else knows, and that what someone else knows might be the reason someone comes home. She looked at the room, the medical kits and the rifles and the students who would carry all of this to places she would never see. My father used to say, she said, that the only real measure of a skill is whether you can give it away. Malone nodded once. He knew what he was doing when he gave it to you. He left. She stood in the empty room for a long time after he was gone, with the Pacific light coming through the west-facing windows and the sound of the ocean faint and persistent underneath everything. The graduation ceremony was simple. 24 students in formation, certificates, the kind of official recognition that acknowledges completion without capturing what the completion required. Calloway pulled her aside as the last of the light was going. He had aged another year since Germany, the way people age when they have carried heavy things long enough to accept that the weight is permanent. But he stood the same way he had always stood. He had the wooden box again. She looked at it. I have the patch, sir. I know, this isn't the patch. He opened it. Inside, folded on official letterhead, the Navy Cross recommendation approved 6 weeks ago. She looked at the paper without touching it. I was just doing my job. You were doing every job, he said, at the same time for 42 hours while bleeding out. He held the box out to her. Your father's name is on a wall in Washington. I know you understand what real sacrifice looks like, but I also know he raised a daughter who understood what his sacrifice was for. Not the dying, the living that comes after, and what you do with it. She took the box. They stood in the last of the February light, the Pacific at their backs, and the base spread out before them, the sounds of the departing students and the evening routines settling around them. Both hands, she said. He nodded once. Both hands. He walked back inside, and she stood alone, with the Pacific behind her and the box in her hands, and the ocean making its continuous patient sound against the shore. Exhausted. On her desk at home, 3 things sat in a row. Her father's rifle cleaning kit sent by her mother the previous spring, with a note that read, only he would have wanted you to have this now. The wood of the case worn smooth by decades of use, the brass fittings dark with age, the tools inside still sharp and clean, because that was how he had kept them, and she kept them the same way. The patch, the stitching of 5 different sets of hands. Both hands, always the team. A photograph from the first graduating class, 24 students in 2 rows, each of them, looking at the camera, with the particular expression of people who have gone through something difficult together and know that the difficulty has changed them in ways not yet fully revealed. Maya stood at the far left of the back row, her right hand resting on the shoulder of the student beside her, her left hand at her side. 11 scars under her uniform, a rifle and a medical kit on the table behind her. She looked at the photograph for a long time on the evening the last student had gone. Her father had told her the world didn't hold together any other way. She had spent 10 years misunderstanding what he meant. Then one night in the mountains of Kunar province, she had understood it completely and irreversibly, and everything that had followed the program, the students, the rating that hadn't existed before, had been the working out of that understanding in practice day after day, with the same patience and discipline and honesty that he had spent years putting into her hands before he ran out of time. She turned off the desk lamp. She let the room go dark. And she sat in the dark with her hands in her lap, by the hand that had held the rifle and the hand that had held the tourniquet, and she felt the weight of them both and found that the weight was not a burden. It was exactly what she had been given to carry. Both of them, both hands, always.